The Bear That Wouldn't Leave. My name is Daniel Harper, and last fall, my wife Linda and I bought an off-grid A-frame cabin outside the small community of Bryson City, North Carolina, tucked deep into a quiet valley near the edge of the Nantahala National Forest. People have asked why we'd leave suburban life to disappear into the mountains. The answer is simple. I grew up this way. My parents raised us off-grid. We hauled water before we had a proper well, heated the house with a wood stove, grew vegetables, hunted deer, fixed things instead of replacing them. Retirement finally gave me a chance to go back. The cabin wasn't much to look at. Hand-built decades ago by a local craftsman. Solar panels on the roof, deep well, wood stove, no power lines, no monthly utility bills. I loved it. Every morning started the same way. I'd split firewood before sunrise while the fog settled between the ridges. Linda would make coffee on the propane stove while I checked the batteries and solar controller. Then we'd spend the day clearing brush, repairing fences, and getting the garden ready before winter. It felt like I had my childhood back. For 6 days, everything was exactly what we'd hoped for. Then, on the 7th morning, I found the trash scattered almost 50 yards from the cabin. At first, I wasn't surprised. Black bears are common in western North Carolina. I'd lived around them before. I cleaned everything up, burned the food scraps, and moved the trash into a steel storage shed. Problem solved, or so I thought. The following night, sometime after midnight, I woke up to a deep metallic bang. Not loud enough to panic, just heavy, like someone hitting steel with a log. I grabbed a flashlight but didn't go outside. By morning, the shed door was bent inward. The metal wasn't broken, just folded. Whatever hit, it had been incredibly strong. There were muddy paw prints around the building. Huge ones. The local wildlife officer later estimated it belonged to a mature male black bear, probably over 400 pounds. That sounded believable. What didn't was how often it came back. Every night. Always after midnight. Always circling the cabin first. I never actually watched it do that. I only knew because every morning there were fresh tracks making a slow loop around the house. One circle. Sometimes two. Never random. Always deliberate. Linda joked that maybe he expected us to leave him breakfast. I laughed, but neither of us found it funny anymore. We stopped leaving anything outside. Bird feeders, gone. Dog food, locked away. Coolers, inside. Even the grill was scrubbed clean after every meal. None of it mattered. The bear kept coming. One afternoon I noticed claw marks on a maple tree about 30 feet from the porch. They weren't fresh. The bark had been peeled nearly 8 feet high. Territory marking. The wildlife officer looked at them and shrugged. He's probably just passing through. That explanation made sense, except the tracks never led away. Every morning they appeared from the woods, circled the cabin, then disappeared back into the trees, always using almost the exact same path. It started affecting our sleep. Every sound made us sit upright, branches snapping, acorns hitting the roof, wind against the siding. Once your brain starts expecting something outside, everything becomes that thing. About 2 weeks after moving in, I installed 2 trail cameras, one facing the driveway, one overlooking the back clearing. The first 3 nights, nothing. Deer, raccoons, a fox. The 4th night, the rear camera captured the bear. At 2:13 a.m., it stepped into frame from the darkness, massive, healthy. Its coat almost looked black enough to disappear against the trees. It sniffed the air, walked toward the porch, stopped. Then, instead of investigating the trash shed, it simply stood there, facing the cabin, not moving. The timestamp said it remained in that exact position for nearly 11 minutes. The next image showed it walking away. Linda refused to watch the footage again. She said it looked like the animal was waiting for something. I told her she was reading too much into it. Bears stand upright. They listen. They smell. That's normal. Still, I couldn't explain why it never touched anything. No food, no garbage, no birdseed, nothing. It just kept coming back. A few nights later, around 1 in the morning, I heard slow footsteps outside the bedroom wall. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. Heavy enough that I knew immediately what it was. I quietly looked through the edge of the curtain. I never opened it all the way. I only made enough room to see part of the yard. There it was, maybe 20 feet away. Its head was turned toward the house, not moving. The flashlight stayed in my hand. I never switched it on. Eventually, it wandered back into the darkness. The next morning, I walked outside. There were no damaged buildings, no broken windows, only fresh tracks, perfectly clear in the damp soil. Circling the cabin. Again, I finally called North Carolina Wildlife Resources. An officer visited later that afternoon. He watched the trail camera footage, measured the tracks, walked around the property. His opinion was straightforward. Large male, habituated to people maybe, remove every attractant. If it becomes aggressive, call us immediately. Reasonable advice. We followed every recommendation. The visits continued. Then, without warning, they stopped. No tracks, no sounds, nothing. For 5 straight nights. Linda finally relaxed. She slept through the night again. I started working farther from the cabin, clearing trees along the creek. Life slowly returned to normal, until one evening, I found fresh bear scat less than 15 feet from our back steps. No tracks. Just that. The ground had dried after several sunny days, making prints difficult to preserve. It could have happened any time, or maybe it happened while we were inside. We never saw the bear again. At least, not that we know of. Several months later, after we'd settled in for winter, a county deputy stopped by with a wildlife officer. They were asking landowners if anyone had seen a particularly large black bear, matching the description from several reports. Apparently hikers, hunters, and 2 nearby property owners had all described the same unusually large bear lingering around occupied cabins without attempting to obtain food. The officer admitted that behavior wasn't impossible, just unusual. The bear was never captured, never officially identified, and no attacks were ever linked to it. Years later, after Linda passed away, I sold the cabin. Before leaving, I downloaded every file from those old trail cameras. Most were exactly what you'd expect. Deer, turkeys, foxes, rain, wind. But one image has always bothered me. It was taken 3 nights after the bear disappeared. The timestamp read 2:16 a.m. There was no bear, no animal at all, just the empty clearing. And at the very edge of the frame, where the tree line began, someone, or something, had disturbed the leaves enough to suggest movement. The camera wasn't clear enough to identify what caused it. Investigators later concluded the motion was most likely caused by wind, another animal outside the sensor range, or compression artifacts in the aging camera. That explanation is probably correct. It certainly makes more sense than any alternative. Still, I've never been able to explain why every recorded visit from that bear ended at almost the exact same spot. Not the shed, not the garden, not the trash, just one patch of ground facing the bedroom window. The property changed owners twice after we left. According to county records, no further wildlife complaints were ever filed from that address. Officially, it was simply a series of bear encounters involving a large male American black bear. Nothing more, and that's probably all it was. The coyotes outside Miller's cabin, a story that still doesn't make sense. If you ask people in northern Arizona where they've heard coyotes the loudest, most of them won't hesitate. They'll tell you it's normal. A few yips after sunset, a chorus somewhere beyond the tree line, tracks in fresh dirt the next morning. Coyotes have always been there. They're smart, curious, adaptable, but they also follow patterns. Wildlife officers, ranchers, and hunters all tend to describe the same thing. Coyotes avoid unnecessary risk. They rarely linger around occupied homes for long. If lights come on or a person steps outside, they usually disappear into the darkness. That's why what happened outside an isolated cabin in late October of 2019 still unsettles the people who looked into it. Not because anyone proved something impossible, but because nothing the coyotes did fit what anyone expected. The cabin belonged to Thomas Miller, 68 years old. He had spent nearly 30 years working as a licensed predator control hunter before retiring. Coyotes, bobcats, feral hogs. He knew their habits better than most wildlife biologists. After retirement, he lived alone on several acres outside Flagstaff, Arizona, surrounded by ponderosa pine forest and dry meadows. His nearest neighbor was almost 3 miles away. His routine rarely changed. Wake before sunrise, coffee, split firewood, repair fences, listen to AM radio while cooking dinner. Every evening around sunset, he'd sit on the porch with binoculars and simply watch the forest. He liked predicting which animals would appear first. Most evenings, he was right. Around the second week of October, he noticed something small. The coyotes had stopped calling. Normally, several packs answered each other every evening. Instead, silence. Not complete silence. Birds still moved, wind still pushed through the pines, but the coyotes weren't vocal anymore. At first he thought another predator had moved into the area. Maybe mountain lions, maybe wolves passing through. Then he began seeing tracks. Lots of them. Fresh prints around the cabin every morning. Too many to belong to one or two animals. Yet none approached the porch. They circled. Perfectly. Like someone had walked around the cabin with a compass. Thomas wasn't worried. He'd seen strange behavior before. Food shortages, mange outbreaks, young dispersing packs. There was usually an explanation. He swept the tracks away with a rake. The next morning, they were back. Exactly the same distance from the cabin. Not closer, not farther. A week later, things became stranger. His outdoor trash can had been tipped over. Nothing had been eaten. The garbage bags remained sealed. The coyotes had apparently dragged everything into the yard, then left. No bite marks, no torn plastic, nothing missing. That bothered Thomas. Coyotes don't waste calories. If they get into trash, they eat. He installed motion-activated floodlights. The first night, nothing. Second night, nothing. Third night, the lights activated 12 different times. Every camera recorded movement. Yet most frames showed nothing, just empty darkness. Occasionally a tail disappearing behind a tree, sometimes two glowing eyes, never a full animal. Almost as if they already understood where the cameras pointed. He mentioned it to a neighbor while buying supplies in town. The neighbor laughed. Coyotes get bold every winter. Thomas shook his head. No, not like this. By early November, sleep became difficult. Every night around 2:30 a.m., something touched the cabin. Not scratching, not chewing, not trying to enter. Just soft impacts, one, then another, then silence. As if something nudged the wooden walls with its shoulder. He walked outside several times with a flashlight. Nothing. No animals. No tracks. The forest looked completely empty. The following morning, he found muddy prints beneath every window. Not directly below. Offset by about 3 feet. Every window. Every side of the cabin. As though several coyotes had walked from window to window, stopping briefly beneath each one. Thomas called the county wildlife office. An officer inspected the property. He counted at least 7 individual coyotes from the tracks. Healthy animals. No obvious disease. No signs of aggression. He recommended securing food and avoiding nighttime activity. Officially, there wasn't much else to report. The attacks, if they could even be called attacks, began a few nights later, not against Thomas, against the cabin itself. Around midnight, something repeatedly bumped the front steps. Never hard enough to break anything, just enough for the entire porch to vibrate. The impacts continued for nearly 40 minutes. When Thomas finally opened the door with a rifle, 5 coyotes stood about 30 yards away, perfectly still. They didn't run, they didn't growl, they simply watched. Then, almost together, they walked into the trees, not sprinted, walked. That image stayed with him. Coyotes normally scatter the instant they're confronted. These didn't. He stopped sitting outside, closed the curtains, kept every light on after sunset. Friends noticed he sounded tired over the phone. He joked about neighbors who never sleep. But his voice carried something else. Confusion. Thomas wasn't afraid of coyotes. He was afraid he no longer understood them. Around Thanksgiving, a game camera finally captured a clear sequence. Timestamp 2:41 a.m. 6 coyotes entered the clearing. Instead of searching for food, they circled the cabin. Once, twice, 3 times, always clockwise. Every animal maintained nearly identical spacing. When one paused, all paused. When one moved, all moved. The behavior continued for almost 18 minutes. Then every coyote looked toward the cabin at exactly the same moment. No obvious sound triggered them. No lights changed. Nothing visible happened. Yet all 6 lifted their heads simultaneously, then left. Wildlife officers reviewing the footage admitted it was unusual, not impossible, just unusual. Thomas became convinced something else was drawing them there. He inspected beneath the cabin. Nothing. Checked for dead livestock nearby. Nothing. Buried old meat caches from his hunting days. None. Every reasonable explanation seemed to disappear. Then came the final night, December 3rd. Snow had fallen throughout the afternoon. Fresh snow meant fresh evidence. At approximately 1:50 a.m., Thomas awoke to complete silence. No wind, no branches, nothing. He looked outside. At least 9 coyotes stood around the cabin. None moved. Not one. According to Thomas's later statement, they remained motionless for nearly 10 minutes. Then, one slowly approached the porch. It climbed the first step, stopped, looked directly at the front door, turned around, walked back. The others followed. Within seconds, the clearing was empty again. Morning revealed dozens of tracks. Investigators photographed them, measured them, cataloged them. There were no signs of an attempted attack, no claw marks, no digging, no blood, no missing livestock, no damage, only tracks, hundreds of them. Thomas sold the cabin 3 months later. He moved to Prescott and never returned. When asked years afterward why he left, he gave the same answer every time. I hunted coyotes for 30 years. I always knew why they were doing something. There was no reason for this. The property changed owners twice. Interestingly, neither family reported identical incidents. One occasionally heard coyotes, another found tracks during winter. Nothing extraordinary. The strange behavior seemed to have ended as suddenly as it began. Years later, a wildlife behavior specialist reviewing the report suggested several possibilities. An unusually cohesive family group. Seasonal prey shifts. Responses to subtle environmental cues humans never noticed. Even the possibility that Thomas unintentionally reinforced the behavior without realizing it. Psychologists examining his interviews proposed another angle. Living alone in extreme isolation can heighten pattern recognition. Sleep disruption can make ordinary animal behavior appear coordinated or deeply meaningful. Neither explanation fully accounted for the camera footage, but neither confirmed anything extraordinary either. Today, the original motion camera recordings still circulate among a handful of wildlife researchers. Some see intelligent animals adapting to a human environment. Others see coincidence amplified by an experienced hunter who expected familiar behavior and became unsettled when nature refused to follow the rules he thought he understood. There was no monster, no creature that couldn't exist, no official conclusion, just a retired hunter, a silent forest, and a group of coyotes that behaved in ways no one has ever satisfactorily explained. Sometimes the most disturbing stories aren't the ones that prove something impossible. They're the ones that leave behind enough evidence to ask questions, but never enough to answer them. The raccoons at Hocking Hills, a Humane Society workers' account. People online like to call them zombie raccoons. It's a catchy phrase. It gets clicks. But if you've ever worked in animal welfare, wildlife rehabilitation, or a humane society, you learn very quickly that there are no zombies involved. Most of the time, the animal is suffering from something real. Canine distemper, head trauma, poisoning, advanced neurological disease. From a distance, those conditions can look terrifying. The animal may walk in circles, lose its fear of people, stare into nothing, collapse, then suddenly become aggressive. I've worked for a county humane society in southeastern Ohio for over 12 years. Most calls are predictable. Stray dogs, abandoned kittens, occasionally injured deer. Every fall, we also receive dozens of reports about raccoons behaving strangely around Hocking Hills, one of Ohio's most visited forest regions. Almost every case has a simple explanation. Almost, except for one, and even today, I'm still not entirely sure what happened. This occurred in October of 2021, peak tourism season. Cabins throughout Hocking Hills were fully booked because the leaves had just begun changing color. The woman involved, I'll call her Linda, was 56 years old, recently divorced. She had rented a small log cabin for 4 nights, nothing luxurious, just enough to spend a quiet week hiking with her 9-year-old Labrador Daisy. According to everyone who met her afterward, she wasn't reckless. She wasn't inexperienced outdoors. She simply wanted silence. Coffee on the porch, morning trails, evenings by the fireplace. The kind of vacation thousands of people take every year. The first 2 days were completely normal. She explored Old Man's Cave, visited Ash Cave, stopped by local diners. Daisy behaved perfectly. The cabin owner later said Linda seemed relaxed, happy. The only unusual thing she mentioned was seeing too many raccoons. Not 1 or 2. Sometimes 5 or 6 together just before sunset. That wasn't impossible. Hocking Hills has an unusually healthy raccoon population thanks to abundant water, hardwood forests, and limited hunting in some surrounding areas. Still, groups that large usually scatter as soon as people appear. Linda said these didn't. They watched, then slowly wandered away. On the third afternoon, she noticed one sitting beneath the bird feeder. Middle of the day. Broad daylight. It wasn't eating, just sitting. Its fur looked damp, its head leaned slightly to one side. Daisy barked through the window. The raccoon barely reacted. Eventually it walked away with an awkward, swaying gait. Linda assumed it had been injured. At approximately 5:30 that evening, another guest staying 2 cabins away reported a raccoon stumbling across the parking area. It repeatedly bumped into a picnic table, then attempted to climb a tree, only to fall backwards several times. The guest took a short cell phone video. By the time park staff arrived, the animal had disappeared. Those details mattered later. At the time, no one connected them. Around 11:40 p.m., Linda prepared for bed. She let Daisy outside one last time before sleeping. The cabin had a small wooden porch overlooking the forest. A motion light illuminated the first few yards beyond the steps. Everything else disappeared into darkness. Daisy walked onto the porch, stopped immediately. Not growling, not barking, just frozen. Linda later told investigators she'd never seen the dog hesitate like that. She assumed there might be a deer nearby. She stepped outside anyway. The motion light clicked on. Nothing, just damp leaves, trees, silence. She encouraged Daisy forward. The dog refused. Then, something exploded upward from beneath the porch. A raccoon. According to Linda, it never hesitated. It didn't bluff, didn't vocalize, didn't attempt to flee. It launched directly toward her face. She instinctively raised both arms. The raccoon struck her shoulder instead. Its claws caught her jacket. Its hind legs scraped across her neck. Before she could react, it climbed higher. Its front paws reached her face. She felt claws across her forehead, her cheek, near one eye. She screamed. The animal bit her forearm, then continued clawing wildly, not trying to steal food, not trying to escape, simply attacking. Daisy finally lunged. The Labrador slammed into the raccoon from the side. Both animals disappeared off the porch. Linda fell backward against the cabin wall. By the time she stood, the raccoon was already gone. So was Daisy. For almost 30 seconds, the forest remained completely silent. Then Daisy returned alone, shaking, covered in mud. Fortunately, the dog appeared uninjured. Linda locked the door, called 911, then sat on the kitchen floor holding a towel against her face until deputies arrived. I received the dispatch early the next morning. The sheriff requested our assistance because wildlife involvement was suspected. When we reached the property, the amount of blood surprised me. Most came from scratches. Facial wounds bleed heavily even when they're relatively shallow. Linda had dozens of claw marks across both arms, deep scratches around her forehead, several puncture wounds on one wrist. Fortunately, none appeared life-threatening. What caught my attention wasn't the blood. It was the tracks. There wasn't just one raccoon, there were several. Fresh prints surrounded the porch. At least 4 individuals, maybe 5. Yet every report described only one attacker. Our officers searched the immediate area. About 200 yards from the cabin, we found a raccoon wandering beside a shallow creek. It didn't run. It didn't acknowledge us. It walked with slow, uneven movements. Its eyes appeared unfocused. Its nose discharged thick mucus. Every few seconds, its jaw opened and closed for no obvious reason. Anyone watching from a distance probably would have called it a zombie. We recognized the symptoms immediately. Advanced canine distemper. Unlike rabies, distemper doesn't usually make raccoons aggressively hunt people. What it does is damage the nervous system. Animals lose coordination. Vision deteriorates. Fear responses disappear. Some become confused enough to attack simply because they no longer understand what's happening around them. The raccoon was humanely euthanized. Laboratory testing later confirmed canine distemper. Not rabies, exactly what we'd suspected. Case closed. At least, that's what we thought. 2 days later, another cabin reported multiple raccoons wandering through daylight. One repeatedly climbed onto a porch and refused to leave. Another circled a parked truck for nearly 20 minutes. A third was found standing chest deep in a creek, doing absolutely nothing, just staring. Again, distemper. Again, laboratory confirmation. The disease had spread farther through the local raccoon population than anyone initially realized. But one detail continued bothering me. Linda's attack. Distemper explains abnormal aggression. It explains the lack of fear. It explains poor coordination. What it doesn't explain very well is how that raccoon remained hidden beneath the porch until the exact moment someone stepped outside, nor why there appeared to be several healthy raccoons nearby without approaching during the attack. We never found evidence they participated, only tracks showing they had been there. Linda recovered physically after several weeks. She required stitches, a full rabies precaution protocol despite the negative test, antibiotics, and months before some of the scars faded. Emotionally, the recovery took much longer. She later admitted she couldn't hear scratching outside her own home without reliving that night. Daisy recovered too. Veterinarians found no bite wounds, just bruising consistent with colliding with another animal. Every autumn, we still receive calls from visitors describing zombie raccoons around Hocking Hills. Most turn out exactly as expected: distemper, a disease that's tragic for the animal and frightening for anyone who encounters it. Whenever reporters ask whether Linda experienced something extraordinary, I always give the same answer: no. Everything we found had a scientific explanation, at least on paper. But explanations don't always erase questions. Because one sick raccoon attacking a frightened tourist makes sense, several raccoons quietly surrounding a cabin before that attack makes less sense. Maybe they were simply drawn by scent. Maybe they had all been exposed to the same disease. Maybe the tracks told a story we misunderstood. That's the frustrating thing about working cases like these. You rarely remember the ones that have impossible answers. You remember the ones where every piece of evidence seems ordinary, until you put all the pieces together. The cougars outside the cabin, a Colorado wildlife officer's report. If you spend enough years working for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, you eventually stop being impressed by mountain lions. Tourists call them monsters. Hunters call them ghosts. Most wildlife officers simply call them what they are: cougars. Quiet, patient, almost invisible. They're responsible for surprisingly few attacks on people, considering how often humans unknowingly hike through their territory. Most cougars would rather disappear than risk a confrontation. They'll watch you from 50 yards away, sometimes even closer, and you'll never know they were there. That's why, whenever someone tells me a cougar stood outside their cabin for hours instead of leaving, I pay attention, because that's not how they're supposed to behave. My name isn't important. For nearly 18 years, I worked as a wildlife officer for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, covering several mountain communities west of Colorado Springs, where dense forests, rocky canyons, and expanding neighborhoods overlap with one of the healthiest cougar populations in the state. Most of my calls involve bears getting into trash, occasionally elk wandering onto highways, sometimes injured bobcats. But the report I'm about to describe has stayed with me longer than any bear encounter ever did. Not because anyone died, not because anything impossible happened, but because every explanation we found seemed incomplete. The man involved was Daniel Harper, 69 years old, a retired U.S. Army veteran. He had served more than 25 years before retiring and eventually purchasing a small log cabin outside Woodland Park. He lived alone except for his 11-year-old German Shepherd named Ranger. His days followed the same routine almost exactly. Wake before sunrise, feed Ranger, walk the dirt road bordering the property, split firewood, read military history in the afternoon, watch the sunset from the porch before locking the cabin for the night. He appreciated routines. After decades in the military, structure felt natural. The mountains gave him peace. During the first week of November, he noticed fresh cougar tracks in the snow. That wasn't unusual. The area had plenty of deer. Cougars passed through regularly. What bothered him was where the tracks ended. At his porch, the animal had approached the front steps, stopped, turned around, and walked away. No signs of hunting, no dead deer nearby, nothing else. The following morning, the same thing happened. Fresh snow, fresh tracks, again leading directly to the cabin. Again stopping near the porch, again leaving. Almost the exact same path. Daniel assumed the lion had become curious after smelling Ranger. He wasn't worried. He'd spent enough years outdoors to understand wildlife usually avoided conflict. Still, he started carrying a flashlight whenever he took Ranger outside after dark. 3 nights later, Ranger refused to leave the cabin. The dog walked to the doorway, stopped, looked into the darkness, then backed away. Daniel later told us he'd never seen the shepherd refuse an evening walk before. He stepped outside alone. Nothing. The forest looked perfectly still. No movement, no sounds beyond wind brushing through the pines. The next morning, something had scratched the front door, not deep enough to damage the wood. Just 4 long marks beginning near the bottom and extending upward almost 3 feet. Daniel immediately recognized claw marks, large ones. He called our office. I inspected the cabin that afternoon. The spacing matched cougar claws remarkably well. There were no signs the animal had tried to force entry. No bite marks, no damaged windows, nothing suggesting predatory behavior, just scratches. Odd, but not alarming, at least not yet. I advised him to keep Ranger indoors after sunset and installed one of our motion-triggered trail cameras overlooking the porch. For 4 nights, nothing. Then, just after 2 a.m., the camera activated. 1 cougar entered the clearing. Large adult, excellent condition. It approached the porch, paused, looked directly at the front door for nearly 40 seconds, then walked away. No aggression, no stalking, just watching. The following night, the camera activated again. This time, there were 2. 1 remained near the tree line. The other approached the porch, exactly as before. Neither animal acknowledged the camera. Neither displayed obvious hunting behavior. After roughly 1 minute, both disappeared into the forest. When I reviewed the footage, something bothered me. Healthy adult cougars generally avoid one another unless mating or a female is raising nearly grown kittens. Seeing 2 adults calmly lingering together wasn't impossible, but it certainly wasn't common. Daniel admitted he hadn't slept well. Every night he heard footsteps crossing the wooden porch. Slow, measured, one end to the other, sometimes twice, sometimes for nearly 15 minutes. Whenever he opened the door, nothing. Then came the scratching. Not violent, not frantic, slow, deliberate. A long scrape, silence, another scrape, always around the same height, always lasting only a few seconds. Enough to wake him, never enough to break through the door. He began leaving exterior lights on throughout the night. The scratching continued anyway. About a week later, another resident less than 2 miles away reported seeing 3 cougars crossing a frozen meadow together shortly after sunrise. Yet one wildlife photograph taken from a safe distance appeared to show exactly that. The image wasn't clear enough to identify whether they truly traveled as a coordinated group. Still, it caught our attention. Healthy adult cougars simply don't spend much time together. We increased patrols. No livestock had been killed, no pets disappeared, no reports of attacks. The deer population appeared healthy. Nothing suggested food shortages. Whatever drew the cats toward occupied cabins, it wasn't obvious. The incident that convinced Daniel to leave happened on November 22nd. A snowstorm had moved through the area that evening. Visibility dropped quickly. Around 1:15 a.m., Ranger suddenly started barking. Not continuously, short bursts, focused entirely on the front entrance. Daniel grabbed his flashlight. Before reaching the door, something struck it. Not hard enough to break it, just enough to shake the frame. Then came the sound. Claws, dragging slowly across the wood. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound continued for nearly a minute. Daniel shouted. The scratching stopped. He expected footsteps retreating into the snow. Instead, silence. He waited almost 5 minutes before looking outside. Nothing. The porch was empty. Morning revealed fresh tracks. At least 3 separate cougars had approached the cabin overnight. One had stood directly in front of the entrance for several minutes. We could tell from the depth and overlap of the prints. Another circled toward the back windows. The third remained near the tree line. None had attempted to enter. None had attacked. But all had lingered, far longer than normal cougar behavior would suggest. Daniel moved into town 2 weeks later. Not because he believed something supernatural had stalked him. He didn't. His explanation was much simpler. I trusted those animals because I understood how they behaved. When they stopped behaving the way they were supposed to, I stopped trusting my own judgment. Over the following winter, reports of cougars near cabins gradually returned to normal. Trail cameras continued recording solitary animals moving quietly through the forest. No further incidents involving repeated scratching or prolonged visits were documented in that area. Our department eventually closed the file. Officially, the conclusion was straightforward. Seasonal prey movement may have concentrated multiple cougars within overlapping territories. The scent of a resident dog could have encouraged repeated investigation of the cabin. Artificial lighting, human routines, or even subtle environmental changes might have unintentionally reinforced their visits. Every explanation sounded reasonable. None explained everything. I've reviewed hundreds of wildlife reports over the years. Most become forgettable once enough evidence is collected. This one never did. Not because of what we found, but because of what we didn't. No attack, no injured livestock, no starving predators, no disease. Only several healthy mountain lions, returning to the same isolated cabin, night after night. Long enough to leave claw marks on a veteran's front door, yet never crossing the final line between curiosity and violence. To this day, if someone asks whether Daniel Harper was ever truly in danger, I answer honestly, I don't know. The evidence suggests he probably wasn't. But evidence also says those cougars behaved in ways that experienced officers, hunters, and biologists all agreed were highly unusual. And sometimes, the cases that stay with you aren't the ones with impossible explanations. They're the ones that seem completely explainable until you realize one crucial piece never quite fits.